Okay. We're big hunters. We had gained access to a new lease about 4 or 5 years ago. The first year went by, pretty normal. Nothing happened. And then, in year two, right at the very beginning of the season always starts the last weekend in September. I was in my stand, second day, and it started out with, it sounded like somebody was talking. And it was like far off. You just couldn't make it out. But it was definitely like something back and forth. And, I kind of brushed it off. I didn't think about it. There's not a lot of people that live around down there, but there's a few, and there's some other hunters on neighboring properties. So I just kind of brushed it off and figured it out, or, figured it was nothing. So a few days later, my brother and I, we went hunting again, and I heard the same thing. And I was beginning, to kind of wonder, it's like, this is really weird. I knew it was in an area that he had heard it too. So when I came out of the woods that evening, I was going to ask him, what he did or heard. And he met me at the truck. And the first thing he said to me was, "Did you hear those people talking?" And so, not wanting to tip my hand, really, I said, "I thought I did, but I couldn't make it out. Could you?" And he said, "Yeah, same thing here." And he's like, "They got kind of close, and it was like they were talking gibberish." And I was like, "Well, was it one person, two person?" Well, he's like, "It was definitely, there was two things, two people talking." He's like, and he's like, "I couldn't make out what they were saying." So that ride home, we kind of spent talking about what we both had heard. And so, like I said, we both hunt pretty often. And a few weeks later, we had both been to the woods multiple times, and each had heard a few more, odd things. We had a few more talking episodes, a whoop, some rock clackings, just a few weird things, but nothing that was definitively anything. It all could possibly be explained away, essentially. So about another morning, about 3 weeks after the initial incidents, I had a work commitment and couldn't join him in the woods. He was going to go hunting early in the morning. So about 6 in the morning, I get a call from my brother. I knew he was going, so hoping nothing went wrong, I answered the phone, and he was immediately sounded upset. After a few minutes, calming him down, I finally got it out of him that something had screamed at him as he was almost to his stand. So, like I was telling you before, my brother, he's a pretty tough guy. He was my bigger brother, the protector, big and tough, and I had never heard him sound as scared as he was in that call. He told me it was like nothing he had ever heard before. It sounded like it was, wanting to tear him apart, he said. And he just was freaking out. And he said there was like a grunting and a growling together, after the scream, that he could essentially feel it shaking in his chest. He wanted to run, he wanted to hide, he didn't know what he wanted to do. It freaked out. It was pitch black, no light. So he decided, make the last little bit to his stand, and got up in his stand and just was waiting for the sun. So, he called me, and he's like, I'm not letting you off the phone. Stay on the phone with me. Stay on the phone. So, I stayed on, and, it was about a half hour. And then, I'm trying to tell him, listen for stuff. And finally, the sun was coming up, and he said he shushed me. He's like, I hear something. I hear something. And then he said, all of a sudden, it was like a freight train had exploded through the woods about 75, 100 yards, and was heading away from him. He never saw anything. He said, but it was, it was crazy. So once he finally couldn't hear anything, he hightailed it out of there. So a few days later, after kind of, the shock of it all wore away, we went back out to our land and tried to find some signs of it. And other than a few broken branches, there really wasn't much, to see. And, my brother, who, I credit for even going back out there, wasn't wanting to really stay very long. So we got his stand down and left the area. We kind of decided, we'll leave that part of the lease. We'll just hunt the other side. It's a pretty good sized property. So we figured we could avoid it and just kind of move on. So, a few days go by, we're talking about it and discussing it. And we kind of convinced ourselves that if whatever made those screams wanted to hurt him, it could have done it. It was pitch black. He couldn't see anything. And we just kind of convinced ourselves that, it was just a warning. Hey, stay away. And, we at this point are beginning to think maybe this is something, and, but a few weeks go by and we're really big hunters. And the rut in Ohio, usually starts around the end of October into November. And it was getting to be close to that time. And, so back to the woods we went, basically. And, a few hunts later, I was in my stand. It was, first week of October-ish, somewhere in there. And it had been a pretty wet year that year. So a lot of the leaves had stayed on later than normal. And I was in my stand, and it was one of those kind of days when like a strong breeze makes it look like it's, snowing leaves basically out in the woods. And, I was sitting there, and then I heard it again, the chatter. And it was, out in front of me, and this time it was a little higher pitched than I remembered. So needless to say, I was on full alert, a little bit nervous. And then I started to hear something sounded like it was, coming towards me. And my stand, just for a little visual reference, it sits on a flat about 30 yards across, and I have valleys that go down on either side of me. My stand is on the left side of that flat. There's a lot of, big oaks and some other brush, stuff like that too. And on my left-hand side, I like to watch the deer come from out in front of me. And there's two natural shelves that run along that hillside. One's about, 20, 30 yards below me. And there's another one about 50, 60 yards. And the 30-yard one I can see always. The one lower, it's a lot harder to see. There's a lot more, brush. I have two shooting lanes that are cut. One about, 45 degrees out into the front of me, and then one, 90 right down below me. And it was coming out in front of me, the noises. And, suddenly it sounded, I don't know, it's weird to say, but it sounded like two monkeys, chit-chatting, you hear in the zoo. It was just weird. And all of a sudden I could as I'm hearing this and it's getting closer, and it sounded like there was two different noises, something on the ground. And then it was like there was something in the trees. And I thought at one point I seen the trees starting to move out in front of me to the left. And all of a sudden there was a breeze that kind of shifted, and it came at my back, and it would have been in my face, which it normally is. And when that happened, all of a sudden there was a noise that it was kind of like a grunt and a huff, and all of a sudden that's a terrible example. Sorry, but
no, it's all right.
All of a sudden the noises stopped. Everything, the sound on the ground, the trees moving, the noises in the trees, all of it just completely stopped. So I'm sitting there for a few minutes. I'm looking, and everything had gotten, eerily quiet. There was no sound, no nothing, no squirrels moving, no birds chirping, anything. And after, it felt like an eternity, but it was probably, 3 or 4 minutes. A nice, gust of wind came again, and the leaves start falling like that again. And then I heard another noise, and it was like a sound, kind of louder, kind of a, not a whistle, but, like a whoosh, whoosh. And when that happened, I heard some limbs breaking, and it sounded like two tree stumps, falling out of the trees and landing, two distinct, thuds on the ground. And it was followed by two things that were clearly running down the hill. And, I've been hunting since I'm 6 years old. I know what deer sound running away, and it didn't sound like deer running through the woods. Deer, they kind of make that bounding noise, through the woods. And this was definitely something running away. And those noises kind of ended pretty quickly. And they were out in front of me, and they kind of went from about 45 degrees out in front of me to my left to about 60 degrees, down the hill. And, that, kind of after the initial shock of that, my attention kind of turn back to what made like the deeper grunts and the other noises. And it sounded like it had come from that lower shelf, about 60 yards. That's about below me, but now that's it's out in front of me. It's probably more than, around 80 to 100 yards away from me. And like I told you in our earlier talks, in Ohio, you're lucky if you're in the middle of the woods and you can see 100 yards. That's just kind of how Ohio woods are. There's a lot of rolling, and lots of undergrowth and thick stuff and brush, and things can just disappear in the woods like that. And so I'm looking for any kind of sound, anything. All of a sudden, I hear like a squirrel coming from my right hand side, and it's coming across the top of the flat, and it's kind of heading down over towards where I had heard the last noise. And all of a sudden it shot up a tree and started barking its head off. So I'm watching right over there everywhere. And I hunt with a compound bow and a crossbow. And on that hunting trip, I had taken my crossbow. And it just dawned on me to pick that up and start looking through the scope. And as I'm doing that, I'm scanning. I'm looking where I think the squirrel's barking. And that's kind of when I saw something when I did see something that kind of changed everything. And it was a hand. It was just a hand, and it was wrapped around like a big oak tree, like holding on. And I'm looking at it, and I'm looking, and I'm, I wasn't really believing it at first. And I look off and blink off the scope and then look back. And, as I look back on it again, it moved. It repositioned the way it was holding. It kind of reached a little bit farther around the tree. And, at first all I could see was just a hand, and as it moved a little farther, I could see a little bit of the arm, like, the wrist area. It was covered in hair. It was really dark skin. So I'm looking on either side of this tree to try and see like what this is attached to. It was a bigger tree. And then I saw it. It was very slowly and methodically, a face began to creep around the tree and was looking directly up at me. It was like, imagine if you're, playing hide and seek, in the woods, and you peek around the tree, to look at somebody. That's what it did. And it was almost a black face, dark hair. And I'm looking down there through my scope on my bow. And as I look, it's looking directly up at me. Now, it's not like searching around the woods to see something. It's looking right up at where I was positioned. And my stand had been in there. That was the second year. I'd left it, over the year. It was a hang-on stand, has a, climbing sticks up to it. So I assumed that something that might live in those woods would know that it was there. And as it looked around, it looked, like I said, right at me. And as I'm looking through the scope, I could literally see its eyes widen, like, oh, what are you doing here? What are you, almost like as if she was surprised. And it pulled its face back and pulled its hand back, and there was no mistaking it. I instantly knew what I had saw, and as we're sitting there, I'm looking, and I didn't see anything. It was behind the tree. And then all of a sudden, all this is interrupted by rock clackings, like someone taking two rocks and banging them together rapidly, like bang, 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 bang. It did it 3 times. And it was followed by like a quick high-pitched whistle. And this was down the hill from where I had heard the things run off before. And when that happened, it was like she made a sound from behind that tree, and it was almost as if she was like shushing them, and I assumed it was little ones. I assumed that she had 2 babies with her, because it sounded like two different things running. And, it was amazing. I didn't know what to think. And so, I just kind of instinctively lifted my bow back up, and I'm looking back down. And as I'm looking back down by that tree where she was behind, she, put her head around the tree again. And this time her face wasn't the same. She before had, kind of surprised, kind of just docile look about her. This time she was not happy, and it was clear that she was not happy. She was showing her teeth. Her eyes were, slanted and squeezed tight. And it was, she was not happy that I was there. And I didn't even think about it. Maybe I'm pointing this, what, maybe they know them as weapons or bang sticks or what they think are guns or whatever, and she just was not happy. So every couple of minutes I'm watching, I'm looking, I kind of put the bow down a little, and I knew, she was still there, because if she had moved at this point, I had kind of found her, I kind of had pinpointed her. And if she had went back the way she had come, I think I would have, at least seen something. And then the wind picked up again, and there was more of the leaves falling. When that happened, she moved from one tree to the next, about 5 yards away. And over the course of the next, 5 or 10 minutes, every time she would do this, she would move from tree to tree. She got to a point where she would either have to cross my shooting lane that I had cut out, or she'd have to take a route back the other way. And it's kind of odd how this little piece is, she would have had to go off of a weird drop off, and I think I would have heard her fall, not fall, but jump off of that. So I'm sitting there, and, she was at the last tree right before, going out into that shooting lane. And I knew she was there. She was about 7 foot tall, I would say, a little more than, probably 7 to 8 foot. And she had a very big body, but it was somehow kind of like lean. You know what I mean? It was like she was just strong, just big and strong, but not real, like, I guess fat, you know what I mean? For lack of a better way.
Yeah.
of saying it. And I call her because I could see breasts. At one point when she kind of went around, she kind of turned, that body turned towards me, and you could see them. I mean, it was pretty distinct. She's standing at that last tree before the shooting lane, and as she's just about to step out, I'm lifting my crossbow up to look down there through my scope again. And right as I'm lifting it up, she kind of steps out and looks up at me and stops. And I'm looking at her through the scope, and she turned and faced me. And she had this look on her face. I could see it for a half a second, and it just wasn't happy. I lowered the bow, and she kind of took like an aggressive stand, not like down on all fours or crouch, but kind of like how like a linebacker lines up, and she just had this aggressive stance, and she kind of began to like growl and show her teeth. And she even took as much as, 3 or 4 steps towards me. So I instantly just put my bow, I hung it up on my hanger, and she just stood there looking at me for, a good 30 seconds, and just would kind of take a step towards me and kind of, growl a little bit. And then she just moved off and went right towards where I had heard the 2 things run. And to the bottom of that hill, it's about, 400 or 500 yards downhill. When she took off out of that shooting lane, she was kind of running. Not like sprinting, but she was moving quick. As she was going down, I could hear them, kind of moving through the woods and making some sounds down there. And at the bottom of the hill, I was just about, stopped hearing them when I heard a big, like a giant pop and crashing sound. Like, I mean, you've been out in the woods, you've heard trees fall down, and it was like something had broke a large tree. And I included in my email, I don't know if you got it, a picture of, it's a pretty healthy tree. And I'd say it's probably maybe 6 to 10 inches around. My gauge is a little bad on that. But it was broken about 3-4 feet off the ground, just snapped over and broken. And, after that, hearing all that, I kind of, I was pretty shaken, needless to say. And I felt pretty unwelcome in my woods. So once I was able to finally get down and get out of the woods, I got down out of my stand and I just left. It had the flat nose. I it didn't really have a cone head. It didn't have the conical shape as much on the top that a lot of people see, but it was very, very distinct features. Big cheekbones and a flat nose. And when it growled and it showed its teeth at me, they weren't pretty white teeth. They were, yellow, ugly teeth, and they were real big. No fangs. I couldn't see like fangs or anything like that. I don't know if I'm sure you've seen the Todd Standing stuff, his documentary. The final picture of that, the one that's hiding that he shows in his documentary, it looked a lot like that. It was, it wasn't the face of a monkey. It wasn't the face of a gorilla, but it wasn't the face of a human. It was almost like the perfect mesh of both, to be honest.